The Friday, June 7th meeting of the Portland City Club. I am Jim Westwood, your president, no longer standing in for Mary Kramer, who's now our immediate past president. This is my first time flying solo. Please bear with me. The first order of business, as always, is the introduction of new members, and in keeping with our tradition that if a new member shows up for lunch, his or her name is on the marquee, we have one new member to introduce today, and that is Jody Dungay, who is with First Interstate Bank. Welcome to City Club. Announcements. City Club is co-sponsoring with Portland Future Focus two of the town forums at which public comment is going to be received on important citywide goals. The club is co-sponsoring the meeting on diversity, which will be held from 7 to 9 p.m. on June 11th at Westminster Presbyterian Church, and also co-sponsoring the meeting on leadership to be held June 18th, 7 to 9 p.m. at the Multnomah Arts Center. I urge club members to attend. These are important forums, as well as are the 5 other forums that are related to goals on crime, regional growth, education, and the economy. For more information on these, you can call Nancy Hedin, the City Club Executive Director, at the City Club office, or you can call Future Focus staff members Debbie McCabe or Martha Bennett, and their phone number 796-6990. Next Tuesday, June 11th, an open forum sponsored by the City Club, which is timely to what we're going to be discussing today. The title of that open forum is Alternative Electric Power Resources, sponsored by the City Club Standing Committee on Energy and Environment. A panel of experts is going to discuss alternative energy technologies for electric power resources from noon to 1:30 p.m. next Tuesday, June 11th, in the U.S. Bancorp Tower, 111 Southwest 5th Avenue, on the 26th floor in conference rooms B and C. As always, City Club open forums are free and are open not just to members but to the general public. Next Thursday, June 13th, another open forum titled Leading Edge or On the Edge, Fresh Visions from Local Architects, the first in a two-part series that's sponsored by our Arts and Culture Standing Committee. The program features local architects and their visions for Portland. It's co-sponsored by the Oregon Art Institute, will be held from noon to 1:30 p.m. at the Oregon Art Institute, 1219 Southwest Park Avenue in the Berg Swan Auditorium, free and open to the public as always. Next Friday, June 14th, back here at the Hilton, Sylvia Ann Hewlett, economist and former director of the Economic Policy Council, will speak to us on the cost of neglecting our children. Her recent book, When the Bough Breaks, The Cost of Neglecting Our Children, provides the basis for her talk about America's children, whom she sees as the victims of both public and private neglect that is unique among developed nations in the world. She will show how the United States has fallen behind other countries in its commitment to children. Please note also that next Friday is the day on which we will have a debate and vote on the club's research study on tax increment financing. Depending on the length of the debate, we may extend our program next week to 1:30 p.m. Stay tuned for that. You also note that with the bulletin this week, we introduced our new 75th anniversary logo. As you know, this is City Club's 75th anniversary year, and we're planning 4 big events. That planning's been underway for months. You'll see it happen in October of this year, and you'll be hearing more about these in the very near future. In the meantime, reserve your luncheon dates, not just for October, the last Friday in September, September 27th, October 4, October 11, and finally for the evening of October 18th to plan to be part of the celebration. This week, you also received in the mail your annual report from City Club for 1990-91. I want to offer special thanks to the firm of Guard and Lesh for donating artistic design and production services for the very beautiful and striking annual report, and especially to the president of Guard and Lesh and former City Club president Bill Lesh, also to art director Ellen Madian, who devoted her time and talent to the project. Thanks to John Sakarovich of our communications committee, who provided editorial advice, as he has for many years on many editorial endeavors of City Club, and assistance to the club communications director, Donna Schaefer. Thanks to her for shepherding this project through. Today's program will focus on a subject about which everyone seems to have a strong opinion, but no one seems really to know much about: the energy future of the Pacific Northwest. Our 2 speakers today are the exception to that rule. They do know a lot about the subject. Whether they have strong opinions is something we'll all know about in about a half hour. I was going to make a special point not of introducing Mike Katz as Myron Katz, and I will now make that special point. I will not use that word, Mike. Mike Katz is chairman of the Oregon Public Utility Commission, as I'm sure most of you know. In 25 years with the Bonneville Power Administration, he worked on special details involving energy planning and policy. He served as senior economist at BPA and also as assistant to the administrator. He has spent about half of his 3 years on the Public Utility Commission as its chairman. He's also taught college economics. He served 3 Oregon United States senators, both Newburgers and Hall Lusk, as Oregon staff director, and was 3-term president of the Portland City Planning Commission. Our other speaker today, Angus Duncan, came by his early public policy training almost unavoidably as the son of Congressman Robert Duncan. In January of last year, Governor Goldschmidt appointed Angus to be one of the 2 now Oregonian members of the Northwest Power Planning Council. In the energy field, Mr. Duncan is a person of many talents. Between 1980 and 1990, for example, he managed development and financing of private sector energy projects employing a wide range of fuels, from that perhaps soon-to-be threatened species of fuel, hydroelectric, to others including gas-fired cogeneration, wind, and solar. He is a strong advocate of conservation as a source of new energy from existing supplies, and the Council's recently released Northwest Power Plan certainly bears that imprint. Our speakers today will each give 2 presentations. They'll alternate, one the other, then one the other. First on the past and the present energy picture in the Pacific Northwest, then on future key energy issues that the Public Utilities Commission and the Power Planning Council are dealing with. So first up, back to a familiar venue where he has attended for the last 40 years as a member and as a past president of the Portland City Club, I'm pleased to present Mike Katz.
Thank you, Jim. It was an effusive introduction. I enjoyed every word of it. About Angus, so-so. It is a great pleasure to be back and standing once again at this podium before the City Club. Northwest Energy Futures, Whither Goest. For those of you who are ecclesiastically minded, that comes from Ruth chapter 1, verse 16. You're not going to get any more from me on the Bible in these proceedings than that. I want to indicate that I'm not speaking today on behalf of the Oregon Public Utility Commission. I don't represent the Commission in these proceedings. I'm speaking only as one of 3 commissioners. Jim said that he thought we were energy experts, and I want you to know that Henry Kissinger once said during the middle of the 1970s energy crisis, and I'm fond of repeating it, that an energy expert is someone who has to commit to memory 2 important pieces of information. Number 1, there are 42 gallons in a barrel. And number 2, Abu Dhabi is a place and Gaddafi is a person. Equipped with that sort of information, you're able to go out and represent yourself, as I have often, as an energy expert. Let me tell you about the past and the present, quickly, and then Angus will come up, and then as Jim reported, I will tell you a little bit about the future, and then Angus will also tell you about the future. The past goes something like this. George Santayana, a philosopher for whom I do not have a high regard, quite seriously, said, those who cannot remember the past are condemned to fulfill it. I don't subscribe to that, but I think it's illuminating anyway and fun to look at the past, and I intend to do that right now. In the Northwest, we had a great enthusiasm for electricity at one time. It happened to have been the thing of the moment during the 1930s Depression, when a large number of hydroelectric projects, comprehensive river basin development for multi-purposes, navigation, power, recreation, irrigation, and assorted other uses came into fashion, power most particularly. And there was a great battle, as those of you with long memories will recall, between public power and private power. This was the last region in the nation to have introduced into it natural gas in 1955. And in the last 30 years or 40 years, we have been on a roller coaster of most extraordinary proportions. Let me just recite some of it. During the 1950s and the 1960s, we had the most rapid, unprecedented load growth, particularly with respect to electricity. During the decade of the 1950s, from 1950 to 1960, loads grew at an average annual rate of 7.7% per year, every year. And in the next 10 years, from 1960 to 1970, loads slowed down. They only grew at 7.5% per year, every year. So for 20 years, from the 1950 to 1970, we had loads growing at an exponential rate of increase, which doubles the value in less than 10 years, quadruples it in less than 20 years, octuples it in less than 30 years. I don't have to keep that up, do I? That's what we were facing. And not only that, but the load forecasters were uncannily accurate. They were hitting all of the forecasts right on the button. And they were forecasting not continuation at 7 or 7.5% a year. It was modified by judgment, but substantial at 5, 5.5, 6% a year. And so we were forecasting very substantial deficits. During that entire period, the real price of electricity and other energy sources was continuously going down, 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 without interruption. It kept getting cheaper and cheaper and cheaper, and that's one of the things that contributed to this increase in consumption. In the middle of the 1970s, in 1973 to be precise, this region suffered two substantial crises, energy crises. The first by way of a serious drought, which lasted until about October of 1973, but it put everybody into a dead panic. And that was followed on its heels in October of 1973 by the Arabs embargoing the exportation of crude petroleum to the United States. And that didn't let up until March of '74. So those two things contributed to the shooting up of prices of all energy products in a most unprecedented fashion. And in 1979, it happened again with the Iranian hostage crisis. And in between, in 1977, we had a serious drought. All of these things contributed to an intense anxiety in the face of historic load growth that looked like it was so high and would never come to a halt. Well, as a result, Angus will be able to tell you about the 1980 Act of Congress, which established the Northwest Power Planning Council and expanded Bonneville's authority very substantially to acquire new resources in order to confront this crisis we thought we were having of loads going skyrocketing interminably. What happened instead was that during the 1970s, as a result of these price increases, I'm an economist, so I have to be faithful to the ideology. As a result of those price increases, loads began slowing down very dramatically. In 1980, they came to a screeching halt. From 1980 to 1987, there was no load growth at all. It was flat. Instead of confronting deficits, we had surpluses, and the surpluses were forecasted to last on into the next century. Things really were extraordinary. What happened as a result of all that is that prices started stabilizing. We didn't build all those 20 nuclear power plants that we had forecasted we would need between 1974 and 1994. Well, one or two or three of them got built, but most of them are sprinkled around as relics in the region. And we have surpluses on our hands. That's where we were. Now where are we at the present? Just briefly, we have no more hydroelectric energy to develop beyond what is already economically feasible and environmentally acceptable for energy. We have no indigenous oil. We have very little gas. We have no uranium in this region. We have very little oil, but we have enormous resources of coal immediately around the perimeter, and unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on how you look at it, a glut of gas has come our way. Even though in the 1970s, we were prohibiting people from hooking up. Prices have not continued up. Not only that, they've gone down, 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 down dramatically. In gas alone, for example, in 1973, the price for unregulated natural gas at the Canadian border was about 33 cents per million BTU. By 1981, it was almost $5, from 33 cents to $5. And today, it's about $1.25, or $1.30, or $1.35, or something like that. From $5 to $1.35, it's gotten much cheaper. And electricity rates have been going down not only in real terms, corrected for inflation, but even in nominal terms. What's happened? Load growth has resumed. Any economist could have predicted that. It's not quite as robust as it was, but it's not inconsequential. In the last 3 years, it's been increasing at a rate of about 2.5% to 3.5% a year. The surpluses have been extinguished. We are now in load resource balance, and once again, forecasting, are you ready? Deficits, once again. Well, that's where we are, and that's where we have been. And I leave it to Angus to carry on from there.
Thank you, Mike. Thanks for the introduction. It reminds me of a quip from my old college tutor and now Congressman Barney Frank, who once presented John Kenneth Galbraith to an audience by saying he'd like to introduce a man who needs no introduction but insists on one nonetheless. Last month, the Power Council on which I sit adopted its 1991 power plan, and inevitably the press and the public attention and comments gravitated to the most visible issues in that plan: to build whoops, not to build whoops, to rely on Montana coal. Are we aggressive enough on conservation? Are we too aggressive on conservation? What's it all going to cost? And these are all important questions. But there is another theme running through that document that I'd like to discuss today, still a subordinate theme in most people's minds, and that is the question of how we account for and how we accommodate to the environmental consequences of our economic choices. In the 20 years since the first Earth Day, most of the energy debates have been dominated by questions of fuel availability and technology and cost, from the oil embargoes and the price spikes of 73 and 79 to windfall profits tax debates and deregulation of natural gas, and now deregulation of private electric utilities. Even nuclear power, in the end, was debated and shelved more as a function of economics than of environmental effects. Power plant emissions of sulfuric and nitrous acids have been set largely as a function of dollar cost of controls versus the cost of proximate damages. The debates we've had over many of these issues still reflect divisions within the conservation movement that began early this century. Theodore Roosevelt and Gifford Pinchot construed conservation then as a means of bending nature, responsibly they hoped, to the economic benefit of man. Their sometime ally, sometime foe, John Muir, valued the works of nature independent of their utility to man. And we've never resolved this debate, although the legacies, the views of Roosevelt and Pinchot are much more visible today. Forests that are operated as farms, rangeland as ranch land, rivers that are operated as dynamos and storage batteries, and cesspools and highways and water taps. Even our national parks are operated largely for our benefit, if need be at the expense of their natural inhabitants. For the past 20 years, environmental protection has usually meant environmental cleanup of Lake Erie, of the Cuyahoga River, and today of toxic waste dumps. I found an article written by William O. Douglas in 1968. He wrote that the pollution of the Willamette River in Oregon, the problem is largely created by 7 pulp mills along that river. And those are pulp mills we've cleaned up, and we've largely cleaned up the Willamette today, and we should take a lot of satisfaction in that. We've made other, still fragile progress here at home in the 70s and 80s in clearing Portland's airshed and managing Willamette Valley growth. We've installed scrubbers on our coal plants at great expense and catalytic converters on our cars. We've done a lot. So why do we seem to find ourselves today mired in environmental conflicts like species extinction and global warming that make us long for the simple challenges of cleaning up rivers and smokestack acids and creating national parks. And what are the instruments, if there are any, by which we can navigate through these troublesome waters and beyond? The single most important question, I think, for energy planners and for the rest of us who inhabit the planet and use it, is how we will accommodate ourselves and our livelihoods to the natural resource base on which those livelihoods depend, and do so without destroying it. And that's the question that I'd like to return to in a few minutes after Mike plows ahead on the energy side.
Angus and I concocted this format to keep you from falling asleep. Back and forth and back. We figured we'd do that a couple times. I hadn't intended to haul out John Kenneth Galbraith, but since you did, he once addressed the City Club as an annual dinner speaker. It was a most celebrated event. He said once, "A very large number of cautiously intelligent people must have wondered if there isn't an element of romance in the enthusiasm for solar energy. Solar energy attracts people with an indifferent commitment to personal hygiene and a strong commitment to organic foods." It's strange coming from Ken Galbraith, who is a left-wing liberal economist. Well, in any event, let me tell you about the future. 3 things you need to know: uncertainty, uncertainty, uncertainty. I mean, we haven't got the vaguest idea. I just went with a recitation of what the past was like. It was a roller coaster, and there's no reason for us to believe that the future is going to be any more predictable, no matter how clever we are, no matter how ingenious or what consultants we hire or contractors we award contracts to do work for us, and no matter how cerebral we try to be about it, you cannot forecast the future. Let me just give you a catalog of some of the uncertainties, and then I'll conclude by giving ways to address these uncertainties. Here's a catalog, a list of what it's all about. Long lead times. We don't know if there's a way to overcome that or not, to build new power plants if necessary to meet growing loads. And it isn't just in electricity, but in natural gas as well, and that includes the siting of interstate and international pipelines. The siting, the permitting, the financing, the building, all of it involves a lot of risk, as this region, as well as others in the nation, knows quite well. Load growth changes. You know, we're forecasting loads now with a high and a low, and a medium low and a medium high. It's like, I don't want my steak rare or medium rare. I want it somewhere between rare and medium rare. You've got all kinds of load growth. But loads will never grow continuously on any one of those paths short of a miracle. I mean, it goes up and down. Sometimes it's high, and sometimes it starts high and ends low. Other times it starts low and ends high. And we have no way of knowing how loads are going to operate. Utilities have been badly burned in the past because of their mistakes, and they are understandably gun-shy now about investing in capital resources, particularly where there's a risk that they might not recover, as they have not recovered in investments in the past. And so, in fact, some utility officials have said that they're not going to build any new generation in this region except over their dead bodies. Oh, I'm not going to. I don't want to make any comments about that. We don't know whether the costs of overbuilding versus the costs of underbuilding are going to stay permanently fixed the way they are. Sometimes it's in favor of one, sometimes in the favor of the other. Conservation, which we know is cost effective, has a more or less uncertain bound. We're not sure how much of it is available at various prices. We have some good engineering studies, but there's a big difference between what is theoretically possible and what is realistically achievable. Energy prices. There isn't a single person in this room, there isn't a single person in the Pacific Northwest, anywhere in the world, who can tell us with any level of confidence what the price of natural gas is going to be 10 years from now. And I can tell you that what the price of natural gas is going to be 10 years from now will very importantly contribute to what the demand for electricity is going to be 10 years from now because of, as economists know, of cross elasticities. If the price of natural gas goes up, the quantity demanded of natural gas goes down, but the quantity demanded of electricity goes up, and vice versa. If the price of gas goes down, the demand for electricity will be reduced. We don't know what these prices are going to be, or economic performance, whether we're going to have recessions or continued economic expansion. And the environmental problems that Angus spoke to are very consequential. Obviously, emissions of CO2, buildup of CO2 in the atmosphere, and whether or not there's global warming. There's a good deal of dispute within the scientific community, but we have to address those problems today. You know that Trojan, which accounts for about 20 or 25% of Portland General Electric Company's load and about 5% of the total load of the Pacific Northwest, has been on the ballot a number of times. Our expectation is it's going to be on the ballot again. And we don't know what the outcome of those elections are going to be. If Trojan goes down, we have to find some replacement for it. It will be higher cost replacement, probably. Angus is going to talk, I'm sure, about Endangered Species Act, because there's been some rather consequential news that came out this morning about that. And we have no control, of course, over exogenous events, that is the world price of oil or gas imported from Canada, even gas imported from the United States domestically. How can we address all these uncertainties? Uncertainty is not an excuse for doing nothing. You have to do something. You've got to make some sort of decisions. Even doing nothing is an important decision that is made. Well, one of the things for the medium term is contingency planning. I'm pleased to report that the generating utilities in the Pacific Northwest and the Bonneville Power Administration, under the direction, or at least with the leadership of the Pacific Northwest Utilities Conference Committee for contractual arrangements and the Northwest Power Pool with respect to operation arrangements, is addressing the most serious problem of contingency planning, which, because we've had surpluses for the last 10 years or more, has been on the shelf, gathering dust. And now it's off the shelf and being re-examined. That's useful. Least cost planning for the long term is the most useful piece of business, where utilities are required to, with a lot of public participation opportunities, are required to use competitive bidding, or at least consider competitive bidding, consider risks, consider alternatives, look at different resource packages. And we think that's a useful thing, and they're clearly on their way. What is most important is that each utility's least cost plan that's approved or acknowledged by the Public Utility Commission should be that utility's most profitable path, most profitable course of conduct. We have to make it worth their while to do what is worth our while, as it were. Using resource options is an idea developed most particularly by the Northwest Power Planning Council, and it means you don't have to build the plants, but you have to prepare in advance all the necessary cheap, low-cost things that have to be done ahead of time so that if you need the plant, you can get it in a hurry. We don't want to put all of our eggs in one basket. How trite, but true, nevertheless. We want to look particularly to resources which can be picked up in small increments and relatively rapidly, in a hurry, rather than those that can only be purchased in large blocks and have long lead times. And we want to put, I think, a much greater reliance on price, because I think it's been so clearly demonstrated in the past that price has most substantially affected the consumption of electricity. And finally, we want to adopt, I think, with respect to such issues as global warming, the good sense recommendations of the National Academy of Sciences that came out about a month and a half ago. And in particular, adopt a no regrets policy that you may have heard of, which merely means there are some things that will diminish the contribution of CO2 into the atmosphere, which you would do in any event, because it makes good sense whether or not global warming is a problem. For example, going after cost-effective conservation rather than a higher cost generating resource. I mean, that's the sort of thing that just makes sense under any circumstance, and incidentally has the benefit and beneficial value of diminishing or not contributing as much to the global warming problem, if in fact there is global warming. And what I refer to as something called Chairman Mike's, instead of Chairman Mao with a red book, Chairman Mike's little regrets policy, which merely says there are some policies that you can adopt which are relatively small premiums to be paid for large insurance policies. I'm always fond, and I'll conclude by on this, I'm fond of telling you about Pascal's wager, which Blaise Pascal was a mathematician, philosopher in the 17th century from France, and he introduced probability theory to the world. But before he did that, he came up with Pascal's wager, which when I tell you about it, you'll know right away. Pascal said, quite irreverently, suppose I believe in the existence of God and it turns out I'm wrong. There is no God. On the other hand, suppose I don't believe in the existence of God and it turns out I'm wrong. There is a God. In either case, he postulated that he'd be wrong. And he concluded, in effect, by saying, what the hell? It's such a small premium to pay for such a large insurance policy. I think I'll believe in God. You go to church in the morning, you go to Mass on Sunday, or whatever it happens to be, and if it turns out there is no God, all right, big deal, you've made a... But on the other hand, if you didn't do those things and it turned out there was a God, you would be in what is technically referred to as deep weeds. There are such things that we can do, and I think I want to commend them to your attention. Well, let me conclude by saying, as it was said when I speak of these clever ideas, that we hope the utilities are going to be following, and they are, as long as you have energetic public utility commissioners who are breathing down their throats with fire all the time, like myself and my colleagues. It is said of Venus de Milo, she is much admired and often discussed, but rarely embraced. Well, if we have anything to do about it, these policies that I've suggested are going to be embraced too. Thank you very much.
So I advance John Kenneth Galbraith, and he counters with Venus de Milo. I'm outclassed. I won't even try to compete. The energy issue, which commands the headlines today, as Mike indicated earlier, is not energy directly at all, it's salmon. And in about 12 minutes, the National Marine Fisheries Service in Seattle will hold a press conference where they will announce that they are going to propose for listing the spring, the summer, and the fall Snake River Chinook as threatened species, which will focus considerably much of the activity that is already underway in the region. And it focuses to some extent, has focused my thoughts on this subject as well. Salmon are creatures that have evolved over thousands of years into a peculiarly narrow ecological niche, which we have in less than a century modified pretty much beyond recognition. Harvests and dams and irrigation withdrawals and slack water navigation and spawning bed destruction, redressing this imbalance, giving some of the water, in effect, some of the river back to the fish, may save the runs now under consideration and for the next year under consideration for threatened status. But there's an underlying issue here, not saving the salmon, but changing how we think of the river, starting to think of it as an organic system that is not to be fragmented, as a finite resource that is not to be pieced out indefinitely. And it's not just the Columbia that is oversubscribed. The Missouri, the Colorado, other western rivers are pretty much exhausted in many cases by the claims that are made upon them. The great aquifers of the plain states are declining, and so is the water table under the Willamette Valley here at home. Anadromous fish runs in peril or already extinct throughout the Northwest are a clear and a commanding signal that our waters are stressed beyond their sustaining capacity. If these fish are lost, they will be only the latest of the thousands of plant and animal species that have been extinguished in the last 20 years. When we think of power plant emissions today, we have to think not only of SOx and NOx, but of ozone depletion and atmospheric warming. We have to think of more. We have to think of the loss of 200 million hectares of tree cover over the last 20 years, and 480 billion tons of topsoil, and of 120 million hectares of new desert worldwide, all this just in the last 20 years and at an accelerating pace. And we have to think that we, and not other forces, are largely responsible for these changes. We are depleting our store of natural resource capital, locally and globally, faster than it can be replenished. Always before, we could make more or we could take more when what we were using runs out. We exhaust this field, we move on to the next one. We use up our local water supply, we can steal that from the next valley over, or if you're California, from the next state. Paul and Ann Ehrlich, in their book, The Population Explosion, argue that the environmental movement must clearly recognize that continuing economic growth in rich nations is the disease, not the cure, and convert this unpopular notion into common wisdom. I'm not sure that's true. I'm not sure that our choice today is only between sustained growth and a sustainable environment. But I do believe that we're running up against the limits to which we can stress those natural systems. Don't buy the whole diagnosis. It's not very hopeful, and given the twists and turns of human history and of human nature, I also don't think it's very realistic. But what do we do when we've exhausted that next field and there's not another field to move on to? Do we add fertilizer? Well, that delays the question, but it doesn't answer it. It shifts the stress from this field to a mine in the middle of a rainforest. It complicates the question, but we're still consuming natural resources as if they were inexhaustible. There's another way, I think, to look at this. And with apologies to Mike, I'm going to suggest that we look at the history of economics as a sequence, among other things, of substitutions. We add labor to land, and we transform human society from a hunter-gatherer society to an agrarian one. We add capital and imagination, and we create a plow, and we multiply the value of our labor. We can do this, and as long as the population doesn't outstrip production, we can still stay within the boundaries set by nature. We add energy to drive a tractor, and we multiply our productivity again. But now we've exported some of the stresses we place on the environment. The carrying capacity of our field is no longer the limiting factor in our economy, and the limiting factors are less visible, they're less constraining, and the effects of stressing those limits are no longer visited on those who inflicted the stress. They're not on the farmer altogether anymore. Some of the costs, in economist jargon, have been externalized. And that's effectively the mechanism that I think has put us where we are today, where the effects, the air pollution, the species extinction, climate change, are too remote from the causes for people to clearly see the linkages or to understand their responsibilities or to apply remedies. So what do organisms do when they hit that kind of a wall, when they hit the barrier of limiting factors? Well, they adapt or they die. And in our case, we take a lot of other organisms down with us. Does adaptation mean calling a halt to economic growth, to get back to that question? I don't think, again, that that's either necessary or frankly possible. The human animal is blessed and cursed with a mind that seeks challenges, that bends itself to improving its conditions of life. Denying human aspirations for a better life is equivalent to denying human nature. We're not cows. We can't be contented grazing in a field. We solve problems. We fix things. We conceive technology solutions, whether those are wheels or airplanes. With this very human quality, ingenuity, we ought to be able to solve the problem of how to live within the limits set by natural systems. We can start by revisiting the premise that the natural systems our economic growth depends on are linear and unlimited, when in fact they are circular, closed systems with limits we're approaching. If we are to continue as a species, we have to understand and we have to adapt to those systems. That means understanding what their capacity for stress is and living within those limits. It means not oversubscribing groundwater, or over-appropriating the Columbia River, or exhausting our fields or forests, or only sustaining them artificially at the expense of some other natural system. It means describing the level of resource base necessary to sustain other species, whether those are owls or salmon or tropical hardwoods, and adapting our own use accordingly. It means learning to harvest on a truly sustainable basis, not simply harvesting another species' share. Now, this is neither Muir nor Pinchot. It's a new kind of rule, I think, that relies on some very basic tenets of economics, but very, very long-term economics, deep economics, if you prefer. It is the point at which the dictates of environmental and economic sustainability converge. It's the point at which we are living off the interest our natural resource capital throws off and not eating into the capital itself. And that calculation won't be an easy one. And until we master its equations, we had better shift the burden of proof away from the natural systems and onto those who propose consuming them. The benefit of the doubt at the margin to the salmon, the burden of proof at the margin to the dams and other users. From this construction, the problem is no longer economic growth. It is growth based on consumption rather than growth based on imagination and creation. If we follow this, growth then conforms to the limits of natural systems, but it is driven by the engine of our intellectual capital, the factor of production, which is truly unlimited. We've done this often enough before in directions that were utterly unpredictable by straight-line extrapolation. We've produced glass, a useful and valuable material, from essentially common beach sand. And then we've transformed the glass into a silicon chip, and we've multiplied its value many times over again. We've learned to reduce the energy content of an aluminum can by substituting recycling technology. Examples, I think, abound. This is not accomplished with an anti-technology or an anti-growth approach. Neither does it assume there is always a technological fix to any constraint, one that will allow us to function as before with no behavioral changes. Nor does it assume that all the solutions will be win-win solutions or no-regret solutions or possibly even small regrets solutions. Some goods will cost more as they are priced closer to their replacement value or closer to their value as irreplaceable goods. This is as it should be. Higher prices stimulate substitution, as they have, for example, in replacing ozone-killing CFCs with more benign refrigerants, and that's happened only in the last several years. How much of this change can we pull off by ourselves here at home in Oregon? Can we just slip away from the world's apparent careening ride towards self-destruction? Well, I don't think so for lots of reasons. There is, for example, no hiding from global warming, whoever on the globe ultimately causes it. But within the limits imposed by larger economic forces, we can at least insulate ourselves for a time. We can give ourselves some wiggle room here, and we can use it, if we're wise, to start that adaptation. We can set and we can enforce the land use rules that prepare us for an approaching world of higher fuel costs and threatened mobility. By accounting for all the costs of new energy resources, including the cost of resource exhaustion and the cost of waste disposal, we can elect to pay more of today's dollars for cleaner energy and greater efficiency in using all energy than today's market would dictate. By not extracting more from the forests or the rivers than these systems can replenish, we protect our seed corn. But we have to look ahead to the next growing season to figure out how to do that. Easier said than done today, because the next growing season now is more remote than it ever was before. It's generations ahead, not just months or years. Will people make these necessary choices? Well, not if they don't understand the connections, not if they can't see the good that will come of it to them, not if they think that others will take advantage of their sacrifices, and not if they are told that the values they've lived by for generations sometimes are worth nothing, are destructive even. But I believe that we will make these choices well and rationally and in time, because I believe in the compelling logic of stewardship, the sense of stewardship that I believe and I hope and I recall animated the Goldschmidt administration in which I served in this city 10 years ago. And I believe that according to that logic, when we truly understand our choices, we will act not just for our own immediate advantage, but for our children's benefit and our grandchildren's. And that's the time horizon the world needs. Thank you.
Thank you, Angus, and thank you, Mike. We come now to the portion of the program that all the members of the audience wait for, and I suppose in a different way our speakers wait for it as well, the question period. The first question today, as always, goes to our board host, Ross Simmons, who is an environmental consultant with SRH Associates. The second question from the floor will be asked by David Cooper of the Energy and Environment Standing Committee, and after that, of course, we'll open up the floor to questions at the microphone from City Club members. If you would like to present a written question instead, there are forms on your tables. Please pass them to a staff member who will take them, and we'll get them up to the head table. But toss your questions out to either or both of our speakers. I'd like to ask the speakers to pull the microphones close to their faces, because I've been told that the acoustics are not so good unless you put it right up so you're almost eating the microphone. And we'll let Ross Simmons have go with the first question.
Thanks, Jim. I have a simple but loaded question that I'd like to address to each of you, to Mike from the standpoint of rates and economic issues, and to Angus from the standpoint of planning and some of the conservation and environmental issues that you've raised. Do you think the current mix of private utilities and public power agencies in the Northwest should be changed to better achieve some of those goals that you've talked about?
In the state of Oregon, about 75 or 80% of all the customers are served by investor-owned utilities. In the state of Washington, about 60% of all the customers, electric customers, are served by publicly owned or cooperative utilities. Just the opposite. We refer to them as the People's Republic of Washington sometimes, irreverently. But it just turned out that way historically in the event. I don't think there's any particular mix, Ross, frankly, that's a superior or inferior mix. I'm neither for public power nor for private power. I don't oppose either one of them. What I do oppose is subsidized power, power that is sold at rates which transmit to consumers inappropriate signals. And quite frankly, at the risk of appearing immodest, the Public Utility Commission of Oregon does not regulate the rates of other than investor-owned utilities. We only regulate the rates of investor-owned utilities. We regulate the public agencies and the cooperatives with respect to safety, with respect to transmission, with respect to contingency planning, and with respect to the allocation of territories, where they can serve and where they can't. But we don't regulate their rates. And so long as I'm on the commission, I think that we're well served, of course, by having investor-owned utilities subject to that kind of rate regulation. That isn't the case with the public agencies. But they're either customer-owned in the case of cooperatives, or the boards of directors are elected in the case of municipalities and people's utility districts. And that's the raison d'etre for their not being regulated. I don't think there's a good mix.
Mike, you're never in serious danger of appearing too modest. Relax on that score. There was a great deal of logic, I think, to the emergence of public power back in the 1930s and the 1940s. By the late 1970s, when we put the Regional Power Act together, for most of the critical issues, the differences were it took a great deal of effort to describe and descry. I think that there is no useful purpose served by public power or private power or any of the rest of us in suggesting that the mix be altered. There are a lot more compelling issues at hand, and both public and private utilities have a very big share of them. The two most important to my mind are the two that we focused on here today, One is delivery of resources, particularly conservation resources, in the next 10 to 20 years. And the other is figuring out how to do that and the rest of our job with respect to for those kinds of environmental constraints that we have to start attending to.
Second question from the floor from David Cooper of the City Club Standing Committee on Energy and Environment.
Just to get at your sense of what the effectiveness of energy conservation would be, given the lack of an energy surplus right now in the Northwest, do you think that ultimately still the way to deal with the need for more energy is going to involve the siting and building of new power generating facilities?
Angus is probably more appropriately the person to respond, but I can tell you that the Bonneville Power Administration, the Oregon Public Utility Commission, the Northwest Power Planning Council expect that in the next 10 years, about, assuming we have medium load growth, about half of that medium load growth, we're now in resource balance. So we have to do something. If there's loads grow, we've got to get some resources. About half of that can be accommodated by conservation, something on the order of about 1,400 average megawatts in the next 10 years out of a total of 2,800 or 3,000 that may be needed in the next 10 years. The trick, as far as I'm concerned, is to make it profitable for utilities to pursue that activity rather than to drag their feet. Right now, unfortunately, it's not to their advantage to put conservation into place. It increases their expenses, and simultaneously, if it's successful conservation, it reduces their revenues. Can the mind of man concoct a more disagreeable, from the standpoint of shareholders, a more disagreeable outcome than simultaneously to increase costs and reduce revenues? And what we've got to do is figure out another way. I have a couple ideas. Angus is right about my immodesty. We've got to figure out ways to make their profitable outcome converge with the social requirements of good sense, and conservation is good sense. If it's cost effective, we have a fair amount of it.
You know, one of the serious and lingering debates in the power planning process is whether the 1,400 to 1,500 megawatts of conservation that we are targeting over the next 10 years are too much or too little. And it could very easily be either one. And that's really the question on which the answer to your question turns, which is, will we need additional new, in effect, thermal generating plants? We certainly will need some new plants. Can we move on to renewables and avoid the large thermal plants or not? And it really turns, to my mind, very much on whether we are able to deliver on that 1,500 megawatts, whether we fall short or whether we exceed. And the downside, the likelihood of falling short, is driven by, you know, whether we limit ourselves as we have in the past to programs, utility programs, and building codes, or whether we, as Mike has already said, actually put price signals into the marketplace that are realistic and that get to folks at their point of purchase of this commodity, electric resources, and change the price signals to both consumers and frankly to utilities. So there's some major, I think, rate design and regulatory reform that's on the agenda if we want to deliver that much conservation. The upside, the ability to deliver more than that, lies in the fact that that we basically assumed in that 1,400 to 1,500 megawatts that technology stays relatively static. But in fact, we know that there's a pretty steep technology curve for certain resources. Conservation technology is one of them, certain renewables as well. And so there's every likelihood that we will have substantially more sophisticated technology accessible to us and lower cost conservation technology accessible to us over the next 10 years. And that gives us the opportunity of far exceeding that 1,500 megawatts and deferring even further into the future when we have to build the next thermal plant, and giving us the opportunity to transition from that conservation resource into renewable technologies such as wind and solar that are I think, our longer term sort of upside destiny. So we can either fall way short if we don't have the intestinal fortitude to take on price and rate issues, or we can far exceed that and have a much more attractive energy future.
Thanks.
Next question.
Sue Ackerman, member. I guess I'm addressing this one to Mr. Duncan. In your last response to the last question, earlier in your address, you had mentioned that giving consumers the accurate signals through replacement costs on the goods they consume rather than historical costs is one way maybe that we set the limits. And I'm curious whether the Planning Council would be willing to recommend to Bonneville to pursue marginal cost pricing for its sales rather than a historical embedded cost pricing mechanism.
Well, I can see Mike salivating over that question. The argument over marginal versus average cost pricing is a harder one in this region than it is probably almost anywhere else in the country, because the gap between the cost of a new resource and the average cost when you mush it in with all of that low-cost hydro is pretty enormous. And I guess I resigned myself 10, 12 years ago when we were writing the power bill to probably never closing that gap in any realistic sense. So what I'm searching for, and what I hope we all are proxies for a true marginal cost pricing. And the one that I think is the most hopeful one, and that I want to focus on, is to get back to the notion of tiered pricing, of in effect a low-cost base block of power, and then blocks of power that become increasingly expensive as you use more over a month, for example. That's been tried before in order to try to give folks a decent price signal. The biggest problem with it has been that folks don't get the price signal at point of purchase, which is when they're deciding to use the economy cycle or the full cycle on the dishwasher. They get their bill at the end of the month, and the amount they look on is the one in the lower right-hand corner, and it's still a total amount. They're not getting decent price signals yet. So somehow or other, if we're going to get that kind of proxy for marginal price signals into the marketplace and get people to respond to it, we have to figure out how to get them that price signal when they're standing in front of their dishwasher with their finger poised over the buttons. And I think there are some ways to do that, but I don't think we're ever going to get to the point where we do true marginal pricing. No.
I subscribe to what he said.
Cheap out.
I thought we'd get some wonderful economic guru response there. All right, well, fine. Ray, next question.
I'm Ray Polani, member of the City Club. I have really a question for both gentlemen, but perhaps more for the Public Utility Commission. Half of the energy consumption per family in the Northwest is in transportation. Given this tremendous use and the fact that there are alternatives to it, how would you feel about a limited subsidy for buses and trains to provide alternatives? I'm thinking of Greyhound, that is practically bankrupt and pulling out of city after city. I'm thinking of Amtrak, that has only one train a day in the Willamette Valley and two in the Columbia River. And of course, I'm thinking of transit in the cities. Would a subsidy be appropriate?
Ordinarily, I have a disinclination towards subsidies, but a subsidy is appropriate when there's a compelling overriding social purpose to be served. And taxing automobiles, for example, to reduce congestion and air pollution and things of that sort, and taking the proceeds and putting it into mass transit may be an appropriate kind of subsidy in order to push people towards doing the right thing rather than the wrong thing. Specifically with respect to giving to Greyhound or Amtrak, I think I'd want to ponder that a bit before responding impulsively.
I'll respond impulsively. I guess where I'm headed is to try to avoid not just the term subsidy, but the concept of subsidy, and force us to go back and look at accurate pricing, but pricing not just of the goods that are internalized into the price of a commodity in the marketplace, but those which are externalized as well. And I could certainly see a substantial amount of justification if you look at the externalized costs of the single passenger private automobile. There are
there is a lot of logic in terms of the consumption of the natural resource base, the consumption of land, the consumption of airshed, the consumption of non-renewable energy. There's a very strong argument to be made that we subsidize the private automobile right now in a substantially greater way than is perceived in the marketplace, and that we ought to redress that balance so that we are more truly pricing, that we are more truly reflecting in the marketplace the cost of driving a private automobile in terms of its substantially greater consumption of airshed, of energy, of land than mass transit consumes. And so I think if we start to think again in terms of longer-term economics and in terms of bringing those externalized costs to some extent back into the equation, then you can get away from talks of subsidies and you can get much closer to what I think is sound public policy.
I put in with about 70% of what Angus said.
Despite our best efforts at conservation, I'm afraid we've consumed all the time that we have available. So with thanks to our speakers today, Angus Duncan and Mike Katz, we are adjourned.